I just saw the movie Wicked in theaters, so I wanted to talk it over while it's still fresh in my mind. Warning, this review does have spoilers. I'm not a huge fan of The Wizard of Oz. I feel pretty neutral on it. It's a fine movie, but it's not something I really go out of my way to watch, and I think I've only seen it twice. I also had no knowledge of Wicked at all. I didn't know the characters, the plot, any of it before I went into it. And that's because I don't really watch musicals. Not that I have anything against them, music and dancing just doesn't do a whole lot for me. But in this review, I'm just going to be very honest about it. So for the most part, I enjoyed the acting, even though because this is adapted from a musical, some of the acting felt very theatrical and stagey, as opposed to how things kind of felt in the original Wizard of Oz. So as somebody who only has knowledge of the Wizard of Oz coming into that, at some points it kind of has a different feel, and it is that theatrical feel. And so while I didn't like all of the acting, I thought the main actresses were really great. Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande did a really fantastic job in the film. And I feel like sometimes when watching these modern blockbuster movies, I don't feel like the main star actually carried the film. And I felt like Cynthia did a really fantastic job. And I thought Ariana Grande was a perfect opposite to her. And going into it, I had seen a little bit of the online drama that was happening, so I didn't know if it was like rage marketing and the movie was bad and they were doing it just to kind of get people talking, but I actually was surprised. I felt like they tried really hard in the film and were successful. But not all of the acting was great. One of the actors from Saturday Night Live was in the movie, and I found him horribly distracting. They mostly had his parts pop up in the comedic parts. I don't have a problem with SNL actors crossing over into other things, but they shouldn't come on and do the thing that they're known for doing when the movie's not supposed to be a comedy. But having so many comedic moments, and we'll get back to this a little bit more, but having that actor there made it feel like I wasn't watching Wicked, but I was watching the SNL episode making fun of Wicked that will probably come out in a week or two if they haven't already done it. I don't watch SNL anymore because it's not funny. And so this ended up being very distracting for me to where it kept kind of pulling me out every single time this character was on screen. And I think that's another big point that I didn't like is I thought they tried to inject too much humor into the film. Now, I'm not against having funny moments in a film even if it's not a comedy, and I do think that a lot of the jokes actually did land. But when I'm watching a movie that's supposed to be serious, there's this part of me that feels like a pressure almost builds up as you watch it. And that's the emotional pressure, so that when there is a big moment, you have a big emotional release, such as crying or getting goosebumps or whatever it is. And I really enjoy that whole process when I watch a movie, of getting to feel this pressure build up from my emotional attachment in the film. But I find that a lot of times the way that they do these humorous moments actually kind of relieves that pressure. And so there were several times I kept feeling like I was building up to something, and then they would make an SNL skit type joke, like when Glenda becomes stiff like a board and her friends carry her away. It just felt like we were watching SNL or Clueless or something, and it took me out of the moment. And it's not that it wasn't funny, it's that it didn't really fit. But I know if I watched the theatrical performance of Wicked, I would probably understand it more. But again, I'm just talking from an outsider's POV. And so that kind of leads me into another part of the casting, was having Jeff Goldblum play the Wizard of Oz. And I keep kind of going back and forth on this one because I personally found it a little bit distracting to have him in the role, because we all know Jeff Goldblum from so many other movies and we think of him as a certain person outside of those films. And he seems like this friendly, whimsical guy. And so it was a little bit distracting having him in the film, but I also think that the filmmakers were probably using him for that reason. We think of Jeff Goldblum as this nice, whimsical, fun man. And so we as the audience feel the same way towards his character that the people living in Munchkin Land or the Emerald City or anywhere else in Oz, how they would feel about him because he's tricked them. It was much like casting Matt Damon in Interstellar, so that you have this emotional attachment to him and his struggle. So it was good casting, but I did find it a tiny bit odd. So I kind of go back and forth. I'm not sure if I enjoyed having him in the film or not, but I understand what they were doing, and I think it was effective in that way. One thing that was really distracting in the film is the name of the school is Shiz, and every time they said it, I would giggle a little bit because it's such a ridiculous name to have for it. You see the gate of the school and it has in metal the name Shiz University. See, it makes me laugh every time. I don't understand why they named it that. Every time they would say shiz, I kept thinking of that scene in Little Nicky where he says Popeyes is the shiznit. And it feels like the name of the school was supposed to be something different, and we're like watching the Saturday Night Live version where they call it shiz, so it sounds like... And that kind of leads me into how I don't like the Wicked vocabulary. Because they have all of these words that are made up and it's part of the Auslandian dictionary, or whatever you call it. So they have words like scandalocious and rejoicify. And so in general, I don't have a problem with this. This was something in the original film, And I like the idea of having a vocabulary that's unique to the world because it's really powerful for world building. And so I think that there's some things that did this in a very effective way, like A Clockwork Orange. In order to read the book, you kind of need a cipher to translate what you're reading. But it really immerses you into the world, and it feels like you've moved somewhere with a new language, and you just have to figure it out contextually. So while I do like the idea of having your own vocabulary, the words feel silly, and the way that the actors and actresses say them sound silly for the most part. And I didn't feel this way in the original Wizard of Oz, but it really stood out to me in Wicked. And the only person in the film that delivered the vocab and it wasn't distracting was the main character, Elphaba. Cynthia Erivo did a really great job at putting those words into her vocabulary, but making them sound natural in her speech. A lot of times when the other characters would say one of these words, they would almost project it and they would say it differently than the rest of the sentence, and it didn't feel like it was a word that they say all the time. It felt like that was the special word in the sentence. But at times when we do see Elphaba talk and she uses this vocabulary, like in the classroom scene, it feels very natural, and I didn't mind at all. So I think it was more the way they were directing people to deliver the lines, or maybe just the way the actors were getting the lines out, that was mostly my problem. But it was kind of giving like Boss Babe, hey, join my MLM, it's gonna be super locious. Overall, the CGI for the film was really well done. There were a few points where it felt like it could have had a little bit more polish done to it. And you kind of had this bouncing back and forth that some things looked hyper realistic and some things kind of had that modern CGI look to them. But I think they used it very effectively, mixing that with real sets. But one thing that they did that I see a lot of modern films that are CGI heavy do, they do these wide angle style shots where everything's in focus and we see them flying through the landscape, and they do movements that would be almost impossible with traditional filmmaking methods. But because of this, you end up staying in wide shots a lot more compared to traditional filmmaking, so you're not getting as many cutaways, telescopic shots, extreme close-ups, depth of field. You lose a lot of that. But overall, the CGI was actually pretty good. One shot that I particularly loved was one of the opening shots of the movie. We see it fly over the Yellow Brick Road, and we can see Dorothy, the Tin Man, Toto, the Cowardly Lion, and the Scarecrow, and they're all walking together back to Munchkin Land so she can see Glinda. I thought it was honestly a really great way to start out the movie, while also incorporating the flying monkeys and setting that up for the ending, and it really felt like a great way of doing this world building and how to start out. And as soon as I saw that shot, I was pretty locked in. Overall, one of the things that really stood out to me in the film was the hair and makeup was really well done. Everyone had such unique and different hairstyles, and I felt like they really put a lot of time and effort into all of them. And their hairstyles even told a story about their characters. Like how with Elphaba we see that she has small braids, which are then braided, which she usually leaves over her shoulder. And then later on in the movie, as she connects with Glinda and starts to get more comfortable, she then lets her hair down fully. She no longer makes her braids into a braid. And with Glinda, we see that she likes to use her hair to get people's attention. And we see that she has these kind of curls that are easily able to wave in the wind when she does her head back thing. Which again was kind of funny, but it felt a little SNL-y after a certain amount of time with how far back she goes to where it's not even flattering. The green that they did for Elphaba's skin was incredible, because doing the green witchy look is kind of overplayed, and a lot of times it just makes them look like they're in a cartoon and they're seasick. But they did this really incredible emerald shade of green that kind of reminds me of the Emerald City as I'm watching it, but it was also flawlessly done. We could still see Cynthia's skin texture underneath the makeup, so we still had this connection to her. But it didn't feel witchy green, it felt like something else, something magical. And I do cinematography for a living, so I often pay attention to that. And throughout the whole thing, I was just really blown away with how evenly they did her makeup. And it looked natural, like skin. As the light would hit it, you weren't getting any of these blinding highlights or spots where you could actually see the makeup. It was just so well done. And one thing I want to point out also is in the intro of the film, we see Elphaba when she's younger. We see her as a baby and a small girl. And with the baby shots as well as the little girl, you could tell that they actually had changed her skin green through post-production most likely, because it did not look the same as Elphaba as an adult. But I really appreciated that they did this because, first off, we don't want to be like dipping children and babies into paint and painting up their faces with makeup, which could be harmful for them. And looking at the history of the Wizard of Oz, the person who played the Tin Man almost passed away because of the paint that they used on him. So I really appreciated that that was clearly a concern and they did not do that. Unless I'm wrong, but that's how it looked in the film. And for the most part, I liked the costuming, but I did find that The costumes looked a little too new. They didn't really look like they had been worn and lived in. Maybe that somebody had worn them for a week as they did rehearsals. And one outfit that I found completely distracting was that of the love interest. His outfit looked like one of the rebel outfits from Star Wars. I'm very confused why they dressed him like this. I wish they would have gone with a different style, and that happens a couple times in the film. Some of the outfits feel too much like our world and not enough like another place. I really like their portrayal of the Wizard of Oz and how he seems like this fun guy, but he's much more of a magician than an actual wizard. And it all plays right along with the original message. And because we know he is just a man behind a curtain and it's all an illusion, I think they did a really good job at still exploring that and almost giving us this hope that maybe he is a good person. But we see, obviously, that he's not. He's a weak man that just wants power. And so he has to exploit people who actually have powers in order to do that, which is a great metaphor for our world. And I think this whole idea of the Wizard of Oz and Morble being the villains of the film, I think works really well. And I like this idea of looking at that story more objectively, in that in The Wizard of Oz, we do know that Glinda did lie to Dorothy right off the bat. She told her in order to go back home to Kansas that she had to go see the Wizard of Oz. But the wizard doesn't have any powers, and Glinda knew that the whole time. And then at the end, she ends up going back to Glinda, and Glinda told her, well, you had the powers the whole time, just tap your heels. So Glinda is participating in this system where she is sending off this little girl to this wizard so that he can manipulate her in trying to take out his rival, who isn't objectively bad, they're just the opposite of him, so of course he wants to take down his enemy. And I like that they looked at the source material like this and took a realistic look at it. The Wizard of Oz is the bad guy. And honestly, most of us would have gone and hunted Dorothy down too if she would have dropped a house on our sister. And this idea of, is somebody really wicked, or were they called wicked as some kind of propaganda smear campaign? And this happens all throughout time. History is written by the victor. And the fact that Glinda and the Wizard of Oz would try to exploit Dorothy in this way. She's a little girl, and those flying monkeys would literally rip her apart if they got the chance. And this film, Wicked, really reinforces that idea of in the Wizard of Oz, that Glinda did send Dorothy out to the Wizard of Oz knowing that he was going to exploit her but offer her nothing in return. But I just really enjoyed that the filmmakers did this, that they saw that she isn't necessarily wicked, she was called wicked because she stood in opposition to the oppression of the Wizard of Oz. And it was really cool because in the Wizard of Oz, we see that the wizard is now using this projection. But in this movie, because it's a prequel, we see that he's using more rudimentary technology. It's a robot's face. And then in one of the scenes, when they're in the attic storage area, you can see another face and it's made out of wood. Maybe that wooden face was the iteration right before this, or maybe that was the first one that he used to trick people so that he could oppress them in the first place. Or it at least shows this progression throughout time, making him seem like a real character, and that this land of Oz is a real place and that he's been there and manipulating them for quite some time. I thought the love story between the main character and the prince was realistic. I felt like it wasn't one of those situations where it was just we're the main characters and that's why we're attracted to each other. They did both have overlapping values. I think he liked how different she was compared to everyone else. But it wasn't just a manic pixie dream girl thing, he also is different. When she goes into her spiel about why her skin isn't green, he was also making jokes the whole time. He was never bothered by that. He also cared about the professor being taken out and wanted to do something about it. So it really did make sense that fundamentally they did like each other. And overall, I believed their romance. And there's also a lot of really great messages in the film about how when you go and blindly follow trends and do what the popular person says, that you're very susceptible to being the worst version of yourself, and you can get caught up in these propaganda campaigns that will make you a cog in this machine that is oppressing the people in the world. And it also has some really interesting messages about how the majority of people that mock people for being different are followers. And that's why they're mocking someone for doing something different. They can only do the thing they've been told to do. And we see this in the dancing scene with the hat. But I'm going to go into that in a separate video later. And so you have this main character and she's been forced outside of society. So she doesn't try to follow the trends of society and she gets to be much more authentic, and that helps her stand up for people. But that same thing is also what makes her vulnerable. She's been pushed out of society for so long and has never been accepted. So when Morble comes along and accepts her, she's really excited and willing to go on this path with her. But then we find out later that Morble is just actually the right hand of the Wizard of Oz, and she with him are helping oppress the people of Oz. And they need Elphaba and her powers so that they can take over because they're not strong enough without her. But the only reason she was really caught up in this idea of coming to Oz and changing things and fixing herself and wanting attention, these all stemmed from the fact that she was pushed out of society. And it's a really great lesson on how not only does society help create villains or bad guys, but that sometimes the people who are considered villains or bad guys, the only thing that they did wrong was stand in opposition to what an oppressive force wanted. And it calls back to times before people had more human rights. And that at one time things like slavery or abusing your wife were legal, but that doesn't mean that those were moral things to do. But because Elphaba has been forced to live outside of people's opinions and acceptance, she's able to look at these things more objectively. So as everyone sees their professor hauled off and they're prepared to do nothing about it, Elphaba springs into action. Because she doesn't have to look around the room and get approval before she does everything like everyone else does. She gets to move freely based off of her morals without having to worry what the crowd wants. And this allows her to be a much more empathetic and good person than anybody else in the movie. And because she doesn't look for approval, she's the only one brave enough to stand up for these animals. And then we see the parallels between our world, how some people are called or treated as though they're animals, and they try to silence them, or how they ostracize Elphaba because she's green. And in this world of Oz, it's very interesting because it is so diverse. We see people of all racial backgrounds, and nobody seems to be treated differently because of that. We even see that Elphaba's sister's in a wheelchair, and she's not teased by the other kids or ostracized for it, though somebody does try to forcibly help her when she doesn't want it. But we see that Elphaba is getting all of that. She's getting the hate that people of different races, different physical abilities, different religions, nationalities. She represents all of the things that people could be singled out for or villainized over. And how our world does operate this way a lot of times. You're supposed to fit into a box, and if you don't, you are mocked, ridiculed, and excluded from the group until you do. Because most societies, they value conformity. And conformity is very dangerous. Because we see it can lead to things like this, a fascist takeover of the entire system. But that's partially by design. They want to keep people divided and they want to look for the others so that they can start an artificial conflict that will make people scared but bring them together at the same time against this common enemy. And we actually hear the Wizard of Oz say this later on, that they are using the animals as a common enemy so that he can artificially bring the community together against that enemy, but he leaves out that he's doing this so that he can control everybody and extract all of the resources. So overall, I really loved the message of the movie, and I think that was by far my favorite part of it. It goes far beyond just the idea of being green in a non-green world. And I really enjoyed that aspect of the movie. One thing that I found though was that there was a weird lack of logic in the movie, and I understand it's a fantasy world, but there are still some things that operate similar to our world. Or at least they seem to. And this is weird because there's other points in it that they paid a lot of attention to the details. For instance, towards the beginning of the film, Elphaba is told by her father to stay with her sister at school for a while until she gets settled in. A woman then tries to push her wheelchair even though the sister is protesting, and Elphaba, because she gets emotional, accidentally uses her powers, which destroys the courtyard. And one of the things we notice in a very quick shot is that this giant placard that has Oz's name on it falls down, and we see behind it there was a mural with a bunch of animals together, implying that animals used to have far more control and autonomy in this society, but they're slowly covering that up, which is a great detail because that comes back later at the end of the film. But then to counter that, they have these really bad moments of logic, like when they lock themselves in the attic. As they're running away from the guards in Oz's castle in Emerald City, we see that she first locks the door with a broom and then pushes a little wooden cart in front of it. Later on, the broom actually gets up and flies to her. And during this whole final sequence, we see that the soldiers are bringing in a battering ram, but they can't take down a door while there's a tiny little wooden cart in front of it. And then there's about a minute to 2 minutes where the guards just completely stop attacking the place altogether so that the two main characters can have a moment together. And this logic break really took me out of that moment. And I found that it would have been much more compelling and exciting had they just put something bigger in front of the door and then had the battering ram going more frequently throughout it. And that whole part just killed the momentum and the intensity of that scene, even though the scene is still good. The part where Elphaba falls out of the building and she sees her younger self in the reflection as she falls, I felt kind of mixed on that scene. I liked what it was doing emotionally, but I just really didn't like how they actually filmed it, how she's whipping through the air and then suddenly she's totally still to stare at her reflection. And then it feels like she falls far longer than she should have. It never felt like she was high enough up in this building to free fall for as long as she did. Because free falling from a building, it's a very short amount of time you're actually in the air. And so it was like the battering ram thing where I felt like they were artificially stretching out these moments in order to elongate them a little bit, but if they would have been a little tighter and shorter, I think it actually would have been more effective. And this moment with her looking at her reflection, it kind of worked, but it kind of felt like a superhero origin story, so I genuinely felt very mixed in that, but I did still feel excited when she takes off right before she hits the ground. So overall, it was a compelling scene. And when she first jumps, it was very intense. It's just that free fall, I kind of felt like they lost some of the intensity, but overall it's still a very compelling scene. And besides the sets being a little bit too clean, I thought the set design was really well done. They did a great job of really building up this world, and we felt transported to a different place. And it kind of had that feeling of other fantasy movies, like Conan the Barbarian or Harry Potter or The Labyrinth, to where you do feel like you're in this new, different world that does have overlaps with ours. And they did a cool job at making the world seem different enough but familiar, like the circular bookcases. And they did a really great job of incorporating those into the dance pieces. So it wasn't just this odd thing that worked for dancing, it also felt like it fit into this slightly strange world. And I thought it was actually really clever how they used a lot of Glinda's suitcases as set pieces for the dance numbers. I thought it actually worked really well. And it did a good job at showing that the people who are rich in this world, they have much more extensive things and gadgets than the people who are just regulars living in Munchkin Land, or any of the wealthy people that we see at Shiz University or otherwise. And that there is this big wealth gap. And I thought they did a good job with the set pieces and having physical sets as well as CG, and I think they blended them very well, which then in turn helped the actors do a better job because they're actually in a physical place instead of just a blue room all the time. And I kept thinking the whole time how it must have been such a nightmare for them to do green screen or blue screen when they had Elphaba in a blue shirt because her face is green and her shirt is blue. So if they had to key that, it would just make it very complicated. Because normally you'd use a blue screen or a green screen, but she has blue and green, so it makes it extremely complicated. I wish that we would have gotten more time with the characters and a little bit more character building. I did like the characters and I felt that they were multifaceted, but I felt like we didn't really get enough time with them. But I've heard that there's a lot of deleted scenes, so that definitely makes sense. And as somebody who doesn't watch musicals a lot, I think this was one of the moments where I kind of started to get bored of some of the musical aspects, because there were times that I wanted more character development, but instead we would just get a song and a dance. Which I do understand that for people who are into theater, those music and dance numbers are the theater's way of kind of doing a montage or letting you know how the people are thinking and feeling, but for me it doesn't always translate exactly. And so I just felt a lot of times like while they were singing, I was like, man, I would have preferred if we just saw a conversation between the two of them. But again, it's because I like the characters, I wanted to get to know them more, so it's not a negative of the movie, it's just I wanted more. But I also understand that if they added that stuff in, the movie would have been like 3 hours. I really thought that her witch hat was gonna look silly. Some of the production stills, I just didn't think it looked very good. A lot of time that stuff looks costumey, but once the movie actually was on, I thought the hat looked really good on her. I feel like it really suited the whole land itself. And it was interesting because as the scene was happening and they were showing how she got the hat, I get annoyed in movie prequels when they like to show us why a character has something. And it's not always bad. In Indiana Jones 3, they show us how he got his whip and his look, and it makes sense and it kind of adds to the character. But then you have like Han Solo, and in the prequel you figure out how he got like his lucky dice, and nobody cares. It's not interesting. Or in Pirates of the Caribbean, you find out why they call him Jack Sparrow, and it's unbelievably dumb. I wish I wouldn't have known that. And sometimes knowing the backstory of these objects, it can actually take the power out of them. So when the movie started setting up the objects that the Wicked Witch has in the original Wizard of Oz, I was getting ready to roll my eyes, but I actually really liked what they did with the hat scene. I'm actually going to be doing another video where I break that down, but I thought it was extremely effective. And it really was a big moment for her character as well as Glinda, so it makes sense why she would keep it, and because of the reaction that people had to it, why she would adopt it and keep wearing it, with the fact that she doesn't conform to societal values if they're not something that she wants to do. I felt this to a lesser extent with the broom, and then with her cloak, I just felt like it was a little bit forced. And then the cloak grows throughout this ending sequence, and it looks really fake in one of the shots. But I did find the ending sequence pretty satisfying. It was a good ending place considering they're gonna have a part 2, because it's really hard to end a part 1 and set people up for a part 2 to where you feel like you had a satisfying ending, but that you want to keep going. And a lot of other films that have tried this have had less success with that, but I felt like the ending was actually really good. It was a good breaking place, and it left me excited enough to where I will go see the second one when it comes out. But overall, I did enjoy the film. Just to be clear, I was not paid to watch this movie or give this review. We went to the theater and spent our own money. But if I had to give it a rating, I'd probably give it 8 broomsticks out of 10. I want to thank you all so much for watching. My name's Jacob Desayo. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and the notification bell on your way out. Also check me out over on TikTok. I have a Patreon as well as a members only profile. I'm going to have much more content coming out soon, and more content coming out about Wicked, such as explaining the ending or breaking down individual scenes. I want to thank you all again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.